Thank you for joining us today. We are recording, actually, this is a little rare for us to do this. We've done it before, but not so much in the regular show, and that we record the same day that we're publishing. So here we go. We were looking to cover the arguments and the different perspectives and different ideas and thoughts behind the Supreme Court hearings from both sides. So we were looking at panel per se, to come in and talk to us about that and see what just their feelings and their thoughts are on this for the hearings. So I went out and, as they say, go back to the well, right? And I got two experts that we've had on our show. I feel that would give us two very good perspectives on this. Lila here with us, who's been on our show several times. She is now with JAS Worldwide, and she's global head of compliance there at that company. And of course, Jason Kenner with Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg. I mean, honestly, thank you both for joining me here on the podcast. And unfortunately, I'm not qualified or even nearly qualified to talk about or even comment on a lot of these regulations. I'm not much of a policy person. I'm more like the person that, or we're part of the group that will help you comply with whatever comes down or decided, right? So this show is going to be mostly all about the laws and regulations. So we'll let you guys comment on that. I guess one of the things that I do want to say, and I do observe and feel like is happening, and then maybe we can start with that. But I'm just having a hard time understanding or believing that these tariffs are going to go away, whether it's fully or partially, only because I saw a stat on the billions of dollars that we've collected so far in tariffs, and it's addicting. We as a nation, and anybody, even a company, it's very hard to turn back money. Once we're collecting it, it's very hard to turn it back. That happened when Trump, the first administration, when he did the tariffs, and everybody was complaining, and even the other side of the aisle, the Democrats, were not too happy. And then what happens when Biden comes in? He didn't revoke probably anything. In fact, he made some things stricter. Well, more on the exports and controls, but even on the importing, still had none of it went away. It was still there. And again, it's because we like the revenue, and so I don't see that changing too much. Maybe going from 30% to 15% or whatever the case may be, but we're still gonna see tariffs coming in at a higher rate than we had. That's my opinion, my personal opinion. But anyway, I'll leave it up to you guys. Lila, I'll let you start.
Yeah, I think that you are correct in that we're not going to see tariffs just go away, even if the justices take the extreme position of striking down the IEEPA use of tariffs wholesale. Even if they go all the way and say, nope, IEEPA can never be used for tariffs, all of these tariffs are invalid, and you must refund all those duties. It doesn't mean that tariffs are going away, because the Trump administration still has several other avenues available to be able to do these same tariffs. They can do Section 232, they can do Section 301, they can do other things, right? So, and that was part of what some of the justices were pointing out during the arguments as well, as they were pointing out, IEEPA is not your only avenue for tariffs. Why would you have to use IEEPA for tariffs, right? And the answer is because it was easy, because it was something that you could do with just executive order. But really, there's other methods. And so then even in the extreme case that they say IEEPA isn't appropriate for tariffs at all, the Trump administration can just turn around and say, we're doing it under 232 or we're doing it under 301. They've already initiated a whole bunch of those investigations. And so you can just make those decisions and implement it that way. But I think in terms of the revenue portion and the refunds, this is a really interesting point, because there's a lot of numbers being thrown around. And so I think it's important to understand what's the real number as far as what's been collected. And it's around 192 billion that has been collected year to date from the increased tariffs. And I think the estimate is that it will be something like 300 billion for the year for 2025. It is not in the trillions of dollars. And so then, there's been tweets about how it's trillions of dollars and we're paying down the national debt. That's not happening. But also then I feel like there was this argument against overturning IEEPA that you wouldn't be able to do refunds because the process would just be so chaotic and so messy that it would just be impossible to do, or that this would bankrupt the government. And again, that's just false. The truth is that Customs knows exactly who has paid these additional tariffs on what. You've got all of these Chapter 99 codes that were created to designate these additional tariffs. They have ACE. They have AI that they use in conjunction with ACE to be able to process and analyze that data. And so then if they want to do refunds, they can. But are they actually going to do refunds, even if they're ordered to do refunds, I think is a question. So I'll pause there and kick it over to Jason for his thoughts.
Yeah, I completely agree that whatever happens with IEEPA, we're going to have increased tariffs, whether 232 or 301. But I think an interesting point is the sheer amount of, as you pointed out, revenue that has been brought in by IEEPA may be IEEPA's downfall. As the government conceded during the argument, whatever powers Trump may have under IEEPA, what he doesn't have the power to do is raise revenue, which is why they tried to walk a very tight line between what they call revenue generating tariffs, which they claim these are not, and forward facing regulatory tariffs. So, and I think anyone who has watched Truth Social or read Truth Social tweets in the past several months knows that these are specifically designed to increase revenue, make the country rich, as they say. So I think the sheer amount of revenue is going to likely lead to their downfall.
Yeah,
Yes.
I
So
would say too that the argument that there's revenue generating tariffs versus regulating tariffs, I've never even heard this distinction before. This is the first time that I've ever heard of it in my like 18-year trade compliance career. And so then I think that this is a brand new thing of trying to create a distinction that doesn't really exist.
And walking that tightrope, I think, lost the government a bit of credibility in that argument. Judge Sotomayor specifically called it out, and I'm quoting her. It's a congressional power, not a presidential power to tax. And you want to say tariffs are not taxes, but that is exactly what they are. They are generating money from American citizens. They are revenue. So, you know, I understand why they had to walk this tightrope because they concede they can't raise revenue. But I think the way in which they did it probably cost them a bit of credibility points.
let me ask you both about the arguments that they had during the hearings. One of the justices also made the argument about how are we going to, if we revoke this, how are we going to return all this money? Is this going to be a big mess? Pretty much, that was part of what he was saying. I mean, I don't know why I felt that should not even be a factor. But since that time, I'm thinking maybe it should, only because it is going to be something that they need to figure out. I mean, I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with you. It really should not be a factor in determining whether the authority exists under the IEPA statute. And I do note that it was Justice Barrett who brought up the idea of the potential messiness of the refund process. And I was a little surprised to hear even the idea of prospective relief. But I will note that the case that was cited by the acting Solicitor General, who was arguing on behalf of the small businesses, John Q. Hammond, it was a case that was completely distinguishable. It had to do with the bankruptcy filing fees and whether they had to be equivalent across whatever court you had filed in. So it wasn't really an issue of someone had paid too much. It was an issue that some people may not have paid enough. And I note most interestingly is Justice Gorsuch drafted a pretty blistering dissent in that case along the lines of if the government takes money from you illegally, it should be returned. And Justice Barrett, who again brought up the idea of the messiness, she signed on that dissent. So while anything is possible, I am not extremely concerned that if they strike them down, they're going to make it perspective only. While we may have a lot of hoops to go through and things to jump over to get that refund, I think it's unlikely that they would do perspective only relief.
Yeah, I think that I agree that because it was Justice Barrett who was asking those questions, and she specifically was part of that dissent in the case where they said, hey, you really should have refunded this when they overpaid the government. The government, charged them unconstitutional fees. That I think it's unlikely that they would only do completely prospective relief. I think this is a possibility, though, where maybe they find a middle ground of saying, we're going to do refunds for the plaintiffs specifically who have brought action in these cases versus we're going to say everybody who's already paid these fees everybody who's already overpaid the tariffs is going to automatically get a refund, and say maybe you have to bring your own separate actions to be able to get refunds. I think that that's a possibility, but that overall, my opinion is that we are not going to see an extreme vote, an extreme decision from the Supreme Court in either case, right? That is not going to be, yes, you have unlimited authority to do tariffs under IEEPA. And it's also not going to be, no, you can never do any tariffs under IEEPA. I think it's going to be some kind of middle ground. And I think that we may see the same thing in terms of what kind of relief is granted. Jason, you were looking like you didn't agree.
I'm a little more hesitant to see the Supreme Court creating some sort of middle ground where the administration can do certain tariffs but not others, because then you're going to be putting the courts into a position of having second guessing: is a tariff too much? Is it too long? Too many countries? I personally feel that it's going to be you have the authority to issue tariffs or you don't, because you don't want to put the judiciary in the position of being able to second guess any sort of tariffs that have been issued by any administration moving forward.
Yeah, my thought was something like your War Powers Act, right? Where you say, okay, well, you can do, limited hostilities to respond to, an emergency situation, but then once it goes beyond 60 days, it requires congressional approval to continue. Right. And so then that, perhaps they could say, okay, we agree that in the interest of national security, that the executive branch should have the ability to respond to an emergency, and that tariffs are actually less extreme than something like a full embargo. And so then we want them to be able to do limited tariffs, but we're going to say that you can do tariffs for a national emergency for like 90 days or 6 months or something like that. And then that they expire and you must have congressional action at that point to be able to continue those tariffs. That was my thought, is something where you give them this limited time frame that's defined and then say, now Congress has to step in to authorize it.
But that would require the Supreme Court to rewrite the statute. So they would be adding parameters that aren't that Congress didn't put in place. And that's why I'm seeing it. That would essentially require the Supreme Court to rewrite the IEEPA statute, because it doesn't have those parameters. So that's why I feel like under the language that they're reviewing, it is more likely an all or nothing type situation. But again, just my own personal feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think if it is all or nothing, it's going to be nothing.
I agree with you there.
So let's go and let's talk about a little bit about that, what you said, Jason. So do you think that this decision, one way or the other, I mean, because it's always been that Congress has the power to impose tariffs and make that trade policy. What do you feel like a decision one way or the other is going to do to that? I mean, will it even affect the midterm elections? Let's say if it was in favor of President Trump, or let's say the Supreme Court finds it in favor of President Trump, will it affect, or could it affect the midterm elections to bring in more from the other side of the aisle, from the Democrats, and then they try to revoke that? I mean, I don't know. It's a big mess. Like, how do you all feel that would affect like policy going forward, and how is that going to affect maybe even, like I said, like the elections, or any thoughts on the tariff making powers of Congress?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting point, because it's one of the points that Justice Gorsuch was bringing out, this idea of if they rule against the White House, and it goes back to what Lila was saying, if you rule against the White House, they have plenty other arrows in their quiver to affect tariff policy. But if you side with the government and say, well, the president essentially has unfettered tariff authority, that power to tax and tariff is never going to go back to the Congress, because you would need a veto-proof majority to undo, because it's very unlikely that President Trump, or any president for that matter, is going to sign legislation that is going to curb his power. So I do think there's going to be political consequences either way. I'm hoping that the Supreme Court says, no, we're going to leave the power to tax and tariff with Congress where the intended it to lie.
Yeah, I think that, if the Supreme Court strikes down IEEPA and you have retrospective relief where, assuming that importers are going to get refunds, that is something that I think, Democrats would want to use to their advantage as they're campaigning in the midterms, to say these tariffs were illegal and it hurt American businesses and it hurt American people, and the Supreme Court ruled against it and that sort of a thing. I also think it's possible that even if the use of IEEPA for tariffs is struck down and refunds are ordered, that CBP drags its feet so that no actual refunds are going out for years. That, that it's something where they're just going to create an administrative nightmare and it's going to be stuck. And that's again something I think the Democrats could play up to say, hey, these refunds were ordered and the court is being defied, and people aren't getting their money back from the government. And I think especially when Democrats are trying to win over a lot of moderates and independents, some of whom voted for Trump and the Republican Party in the last election, that they can use their own idea of big government, being anti-big government, against them in that way, right? The government took your money and they won't give it back. So I think that that's an
Yeah.
interesting argument that they could come up with. If the tariffs are upheld, then it's just, hey, are we going to continue to see effects on inflation and consumer prices resulting from the continuation of the tariffs that again are going to be used to make arguments for the midterms to change?
Yeah. And we saw in the recent elections in New Jersey and Virginia that affordability is a big issue for everybody right now. And again, if the IEEPA tariffs are allowed to continue, it is going to be something that Democrats can point to as impacting of affordability, along with the Affordable Care Act subsidies and the rest of the Democratic talking.
Great, great. So, Lila, let's switch a little bit more to the actual importers or the practitioners themselves, the people who are in compliance that are, let's say, are mostly our audience here that are listening in. What do you feel like in their standpoint, like what do you feel a ruling in favor of the White House might mean for importers and exporters, day to day? I mean, it will they be living in fear, let's say, in that at the drop of a hat, an IEEPA can be can be implemented, and then here we go again. I mean, just like what is their sentiment? What do you feel might be the implications for that?
Well, I think that when it comes to trade compliance, both on the customs side and on the export side, that one of the major changes that we've seen this year is dramatic changes being implemented extremely quickly. Where I think about the BIS 50% rule, which was rumored for a few months, but then it was announced and implemented in the scope of a day and then suspended. And that was all in the course of 1 month, right? And that, previously, we had trade rules like this that were going through a formal notice and comment period that would take months to years to be able to implement, where it was an interim rule and there were public comments, and then there's a final rule with an implementation date later. And then, now we had a 1 day time period between the publishing of the rule and when it was effective. And that, the tariffs are being implemented really quickly. We had tariffs on Japan, a couple of months ago, where it was announced on a Friday afternoon and it was effective as of midnight on Monday. And so, unfortunately, you had a lot of customs brokers who lost a lot of sleep over that weekend because they were furiously trying to make, the updates needed to their systems and change entries and determine arrival dates and all of that good stuff. And so, I think what trade compliance professionals need to be aware of and communicating upwards within their organization is that the pace of change has changed dramatically. That no longer can you count on having months of notice to be able to implement major changes that are affecting your trade compliance, that are affecting your bottom line when it comes to your importing and exporting activities. And so then you have to be prepared to make those changes faster. You have to be more dynamic with that. And so, yes, if the use of IEEPA for tariffs is affirmed, then you know that this is something where it's going to be much easier, not just for this president and this administration, but for future administrations to change tariffs much more quickly and easily than what has been done in the past.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, we filed an amicus brief in the Supreme Court on behalf of an organization called We Pay the Tariffs, and it was a kind of a retrospective from small businesses across the country, talking about the harms that the IEEPA tariffs were imposing, and it just wasn't the rates; it was the extreme volatility. It was the idea that I can order something today, and by the time it comes from overseas, the duty rates can be completely different, despite the fact that I've already got purchase contracts and invoices and all those things. So if IEEPA is upheld, I think we're going to see a lot more of that volatility. And I think it's going to be extremely detrimental, especially to the smaller businesses that can't absorb and react quickly enough.
But I guess that still brings us to the fact that EPA, I mean, it literally means, Emergency Powers Act. So I guess any current and any future president is going to have to define what that emergency is. I don't know how easy that. Maybe the courts are going to put some guardrails on that, just to make sure that they don't just declare random
Well,
act as emergency.
so that's, I mean, therein lies the rub on like the non-delegation doctrine. It's a matter of if the Congress is and has intended to shift over its power to tax and tariff to the president under IEEPA, there are no guardrails because it's just a presidential declaration of emergency. They're really, they don't really want courts to dig into that foreign policy decision making of a president as to what is an emergency. I do note that Justice Sotomayor specifically said, "Listen, what you're dealing with here is essentially taxes that have not been determined, decided to be beneficial by the two houses of Congress and the executive, but essentially taxes and tariffs because the president may be upset about a commercial that happened to be played during the World Series." So, and I think that's the problem. That's why even if the term regulate is you define it as broadly as you like to include tariffs, you then run into a major questions problem, which requires massive economic issues of massive economic importance to be very clear in the statute, which clearly regulate is not. If you had 3 hours of argument about what regulate means, and even if it was clear enough, then you do run into the non-delegation doctrine of that there really isn't very much of the way of guardrails. Based on the government's own argument, it's unreviewable the emergency. It's unreviewable what actions the president has taken. The only thing that the government concedes is reviewable is what does that term regulate mean? And once the courts say regulate means tariffs, it's pretty much hands off as far as the courts go.
And I think that this was part of where I saw the argument of, these being, responding to a national emergency as being really weak, because the national emergencies they were bringing up were things that either didn't exist or aren't a national emergency, right? So the idea that having a trade deficit that we've had for 40 years is a national emergency just doesn't hold water. No one is buying that. That you've had a trade deficit for decades, and it's not like it's suddenly changed from one year to the next. It's been very gradual in the way that it's changed over the past at least 10 or 20 years. And so then that's not a good argument for a national emergency. With the fentanyl tariffs, I feel like if they had limited the fentanyl tariffs to China and Mexico, you would have a much stronger argument there, because you have real evidence, direct evidence that China and Mexico are involved in the fentanyl distribution, right? That precursor chemicals come from China. You have cartels in Mexico that manufacture the fentanyl. That's where it's coming from into the US. And you could argue that that's a legitimate emergency. Once they added Canada into the fentanyl tariffs, I feel like that lost credibility, because Canada has zero to do with fentanyl trade. They seized all of 1 kilogram of fentanyl from Canada in so far this year, right? Like it's so minor it doesn't make sense. And so again, I feel like that undercuts this idea that this is a national emergency that we're responding to. And again, goes back to it's revenue raising, it's based on political decisions, it's not truly foreign policy based where it should be completely within the executive branch's discretion.
To that, I would just add that the government's been pretty careful in arguing, when it comes to the trade deficit, it's an emergency. Their point is it's not necessarily the trade deficit, which everyone concedes is something that has gone on historically, but it is the tipping point that we've reached on U.S. manufacturing, that it has gutted U.S. manufacturing, and that is an emergency. And it was enough to sway at least 4 of the federal circuit judges that it was an emergency. So, I mean, I don't think we can discount that certain judges may feel that the impacts of a trade deficit on manufacturing capability, ship repair, ship building, pharmaceuticals, all those things may be a legitimate emergency.
Yeah. And I think on that one, for the trade community, we look at that and we say, okay, well, if your goal is to return the manufacturing of those certain industries to the US, why did you do tariffs that aren't really even enough to actually compete with the costs there? Why not just do quotas, right? You already have the ability to do quotas. You could have put quotas in place, made them in a stepped way, a graduated way, to say, we're going to gradually reduce the quantity that you can import so that you are forced to bring manufacturing back to the US, and have targeted at the certain industries that you want, right? President Trump tweeted at one point like, oh, we don't want to make t-shirts. Like, well, then why are you putting all of these high tariffs on clothing, right? Why not have this be much more focused to say, I want to make more pharmaceuticals here. I want to make steel and aluminum here. I want to build ships here, right? And focus on those industries where you really want to bring back manufacturing jobs, and use quotas to do it, rather than doing tariffs where I saw one statistic where a person was saying, oh, the tariffs would have to be 1,000% to make up for the cost difference between manufacturing in China versus the US, right? And so then I feel like the tariffs are just really not the best method of achieving what they say is their goal.
Certainly. And then you also had to that, machinery necessary for production lines is also subjected to tariffs. So, I mean, you're really not incentivizing anyone to start importing machinery for production, even into this country. So I think what I do think is clear to most folks is that this is a revenue generating idea, especially when you now see the idea of $2,000 tariff rebate checks going out to American citizens. I think it's hard as a hard argument to make that this is not a revenue generating measure.
Well, I think that
And it
people
is
will
in the
get their
fact that
tariff
I guess
refund checks about the same time. I think that people will get their tariff refund checks.
But he's certainly trying to raise support for the IEEPA tariff idea right now, which leads me to believe that the administration is not extremely confident in its ability to win in the Supreme Court.
Are there any other things that you all feel that I might have left out that I should be asking before we wrap up, or like something very critical?
I think just another note about, what trade compliance folks, in-house trade compliance folks should be looking at. I think that they should really be seeking to manage expectations of their senior leadership. That I think what we saw a lot of with the initial CIT decision and then with the Court of Appeals decision was people jumping the gun and saying, great, where's my refund? And thinking that this was going to be some kind of immediate thing where they were getting tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars back, and that is just not the case, right? That even in the event that there are refunds ordered, that is a process that is going to take time, and that it doesn't mean that you're no longer going to have to pay the tariffs either, because like we talked about, the Trump administration can very easily just use Section 232, Section 301, or other options as well to implement the exact same tariffs or higher tariffs, right? And so then that I would really seek to manage expectations of your senior leadership to say, just because even if the Supreme Court rules against IEEPA use for tariffs, it doesn't mean we're immediately getting refunds, and it doesn't mean that we're going to immediately have, no more of these really high tariffs on our imports.
Yeah. And I would echo exactly everything that Lila just said. And in fact, Justice Alito, he brought up the idea of using Section 338, which is 50% on countries that discriminate against U.S. imports. So I don't see tariffs going away. Best case scenario, they're not going to be coming fast and furious under IEEPA. And best case scenario, maybe we get refunds of the IEEPA tariffs already paid, but it's not going to be relief in the sense that we're going back to the low levels of tariffs we had prior to the current administration.
Perfect. So any last words, I guess, so we can wrap up? Is there what is your one, I guess, takeaway, or okay, let's say if you're a betting person, let's put you guys on the line or on the spot. If you're a betting person, where would you lean? And where do you think this is going to come down?
So I still think that there's going to be some kind of middle ground of not full invalidation and not full sign on to IEEPA tariffs for everybody, right? I think that they're going to try to find something where to give the president limited powers here. That's my thought of where it's going to come. I still think there's going to be something in between the two extremes.
I think the importers had the better of the argument. They have the better of the legal argument. They also have the better of the optics in terms of what these tariffs have done to the country. I tend to lean towards, if the Supreme Court rules in favor of the importers, it's going to be on this issue that the term regulate is not broad enough to cover the power to impose tariffs. Because again, otherwise you are now going to have the judiciary as a second guesser to all tariffs ever issued by a president under IEEPA. And I don't think that's a situation that the Supreme Court.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you both. Thank you for joining me here at the 11th hour, let's say, to record this episode, and we really appreciate that. We'll definitely circle back with you whenever a decision comes down. They say 1 to 3 months, but I'm thinking it's a little on the quick side than it is on the longer side, only because of either you stop paying tariffs or you continue paying tariffs because it's justified or it's been decided, So I think it will should or anyway come down quickly. So thank you both for joining us. For anybody that's listening to this, remember you can see and catch Lila and Jason's contact information and information down in the show notes. Just take a look. Well, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to catching up next week on another trade topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.